Hello, welcome. I'm Jessica González, co-CEO of Free Press Action. I want to thank Senator Lujan for co-hosting this discussion and the Real Facebook Oversight Board for its partnership on this event. Disinformation on social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter about elections, the pandemic, vaccines, climate change, and other issues is rampant. We're here today to shine a light on how social media platforms have been particularly bad about protecting the integrity of their systems in Spanish and other non-English languages. We'll briefly discuss the harms this is causing here in the United States and around the globe. But the main point of today is to start talking about concrete solutions that will help us build the internet we deserve, one that supports truth, justice, and democracy. This roundtable will be conducted on the record with a round of opening remarks followed by questions from the press. We are recording this session and may air all or part of it in the days to come. Reporters, we will begin a Q&A session about halfway through the hour. Starting now, you may identify yourselves, your outlets, and pose your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom. We will get to as many of them as we can. We have a distinguished lineup of experts from government and civil society, including our co-host, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, Senator Amy Klobuchar, who will join us in progress, Congressman Tony Cardenas, FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly-Slaughter, Stephanie Valencia of EquisLabs, Brenda Castillo of National Hispanic Media Coalition, Nick Nguyen of Viet Fact Check, Jacquelyn Mason from the Disinformation Defense League, and Stephen Renderos from Media Justice. That is a packed lineup, and we promise to move through it at a very good clip so that we can get to the press Q&A. Over this past month, the Facebook papers have revealed not only that Facebook knew it was amplifying lies and bigotry and destabilizing our democracy, but that it engaged in a serial cover-up of the harms it was causing society. The Facebook papers also confirmed what many of us have long suspected, that Facebook has deeply underinvested in keeping its platforms safe for non-English speakers. So much of the last month has been focused on Facebook's ills, and for good reason, but the proliferation of non-English disinformation is systemic across social media, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Google, WhatsApp, and beyond. Today, we share exclusive breaking news from the Global Disinformation Index detailing the ways that Google and other online ad services prop up Spanish language disinformation sites. The Global Disinformation Index estimates that advertisers will unwittingly provide over $12 million to 56 Spanish language COVID disinformation sites this year. Their new research estimates that Google alone will funnel over $6 million into Spanish language COVID disinformation sites in 2021. Action is long overdue. So without much further ado, I want to turn it over to our co-host, Senator Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico. Senator Lujan is the chairman of the Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Communications, Media, and Broadband. Senator, first, I want to thank you for being here today and for your leadership on this issue. Over the summer, you and a number of colleagues wrote to Twitter, Facebook, Nextdoor, and Google, seeking answers about their role in spreading non-English disinformation. Please open us up with some initial thoughts about this issue and what you hope we can accomplish here today.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and to all the speakers and attendees today. And a special thank you to Senator Klobuchar and Congressman Cardenas for their partnership in restoring trust in our democracy, to Commissioner Slaughter for her championing equity and access at the FTC, Brenda Castillo and the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Jacquelyn Mason at the Media Democracy Fund, Nick Nguyen at Viet Fact Check, and Stephen Renderos of Media Justice, and of course to Stephanie Valencia at EquisLabs. Reliable and trustworthy information is a basic necessity in today's world. Each of you bring an important understanding of the problem, and the work you do is critical to finding a solution. Trust is the fundamental issue we are talking about today. And social media and the internet continue to disrupt how we communicate with one another, enabling new ways to stay connected, but also eroding the systems of trust that we once relied on. We need the latest and best information about dangerous diseases to keep ourselves and our families safe. We need to know when a natural disaster might require us to evacuate our home for safer ground. And we need to know that our elected officials are living up to their commitments so that we can keep them honest at the ballot box. But trust, a core tenet of our democracy, is under threat. People looking to spread division, fan extremism, and make a quick profit have found ways to exploit social media and other online platforms. They challenge trust in new ways that we are unprepared for. And I've seen this in my home in New Mexico. Many of my constituents have had to repeatedly correct bad information spread in private WhatsApp groups. Tribal communities targeted with COVID-19 scams at alarming rates have turned to old networks of trusted voices to push back. These lies have cost people their health and livelihood. Disinformation lives and spreads in the spaces between trust. And as the recent Facebook revelations make clear, the problem is far worse for families and communities when they speak Spanish or other non-English languages. Platforms use a vast majority of their resources to root out misinformation within English language content. And even then, they're not doing a great job. Most alarmingly, they've considered supporting Spanish language election resources to be partisan. Now, the notion that Facebook executives may have killed a project to promote Spanish language election information on WhatsApp because it would not be, quote, politically neutral is unacceptable. That is why just this morning, Senator Klobuchar and I sent a letter to Mr. Zuckerberg on this very topic to demand answers. Sending election information in Spanish is not political bias. Equal access is essential for Latinos to fully participate in our democracy. We have documents, we have statements, we have evidence, and what we need now is action. First, we need transparency. Trust requires that the public know what these companies are doing to keep our community safe. Earlier this year, I wrote a letter with Congressman Cardenas and Senator Klobuchar asking these companies to provide real evidence for their investment in removing non-English misinformation from their platforms. The information the platform sent us proved that platforms will not voluntarily provide enough information for the public and Congress to understand the scale and scope of the problem. Next, we need oversight. I have urged Facebook repeatedly to provide the data used in their studies so their results could be independently verified. But instead, Facebook has closed off researchers' access to make oversight more and more difficult. When companies do start research programs, the information provided is often incomplete or behind schedule. This needs to be a priority for these companies. And finally, we need accountability. A company must be accountable when its platform amplifies and promotes hateful content that targets a minority community and contributes to a violation of their fundamental civil rights. We should make these companies accountable for their algorithms when they encourage extreme content in service of their bottom line. And that is why we are here today, to understand the problem facing us and to explore solutions to restore trust. Every American deserves access to reliable and trustworthy information, regardless of the language they use at home and online. And I'm grateful for Free Press's work in helping arrange this discussion, and I look forward to hearing from the speakers. Thanks again, Jessica.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. I'd like to turn next to Congressman Tony Cardenas from Los Angeles. Congressman Cardenas, you were out ahead on this issue. In March, you joined Ya Basta Facebook campaign leaders to shine a light on Spanish language disinformation and call on the platforms to course correct. What have you learned since then about the extent and impacts of non-English disinformation? And is it time for legislation and regulation, sir? Congressman, I believe you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jessica. I've had the responsibility and the opportunity to ask the CEOs of these organizations directly. And for example, when I had asked Zuckerberg questions in the Energy and Commerce Committee, I had the opportunity to hear, once again, his very soft answers. Yes, we can do more. Yes, we want to do more. Yes, we will do more. But as we just realized from Ms. Hagen, who actually exposed the fact that they have not been doing more because they choose not to. And that is a very, very deadly tact for them to take, because everybody knows that disinformation, misinformation when it comes to COVID-19, and having good, hardworking people start to succumb to these pressures and these ideas that they're seeing on the internet are telling them that that COVID-19 is a hoax, or that these vaccines are dangerous, et cetera. Not basing anything on fact, but just allowing that to perpetrate in a way that it actually convinces good people to risk their lives for no good reason. And in addition to that, it's really important for us to understand that this is happening disproportionately to people who get their information in Spanish and other languages. I pointed out to these CEOs, including Mark Zuckerberg, that they themselves are admitting that they are not putting as much resources into multi-language efforts to correct like they are doing in English. They acknowledge that, and they only said that they will do more. Again, Ms. Hagen proved to us that they are calculating how much it would cost them to do that, yet they're not recognizing how much it costs individuals and families and the community writ large when people succumb to this disinformation, this misinformation. So you asked me a question, do we need legislation? Unfortunately, we do. They would love to self-police. They claim that they've been self-policing. They've claimed that they've come very far, but in fact, they have not. And one thing that I'd like to point out is, please understand this, the Ya Basta Facebook campaign is something that is actually helping. We can't just do it with legislation alone. It's important that these organizations know that millions upon millions upon millions of people understand that they need to be more responsible, that these organizations need to be responsible. So please continue the fight. I know it's hard to fight a multi-trillion-dollar industry, but please understand we can and must prevail because lives depend on it. And yes, legislation is necessary. And also we need our regulators as well to buckle down and actually require more and more of them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And
thank you to Senator Ben Ray Lujan. I miss you on the Energy and Commerce Committee, but now that you're in the United States Senate, you're in a different place, a good place, and I know you're continuing the fight. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Congressman. If I can assure you of one thing on behalf of this whole group, I can assure you that we will continue the fight. I'd like to turn to a brief panel of experts from the field. We have researchers, grassroots leaders, and others with us today. First up is Stephanie Valencia, co-founder and president of EquisLabs, which is leading research on the prevalence and patterns of disinformation targeting Latinos. Stephanie, what is your research showing us about how Latinos and Spanish speakers are being targeted on social media?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everybody for joining the call today, and for Congressman Cardenas, and of course my old childhood friend, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, for your leadership on this issue and your partnership. What we know and what we've seen in our research is that there is a real asymmetry between how Facebook, YouTube, and the other social media platforms are treating Spanish language disinformation. We know that for all the harm that Facebook and other companies are allowing to flourish in English, their handling of Spanish content is dramatically worse. Our research has shown that social media networks, including Facebook and YouTube, are not doing enough to combat misinformation in Spanish. Avaaz found that Facebook has failed to issue warning labels on 70% of Spanish language misinformation, compared to only 29% in English. Whistleblower Frances Haugen's testimony over the last few weeks has revealed that 87% of misinformation spending is focused on English, and about 9% of Facebook's users are actually English speakers. So there is a huge disparity in what they're actually spending online. Equis has tracked and flagged for the social media platforms multiple narratives on election voter fraud, vaccine disinformation, QAnon, et cetera, things that were existing in November 2020 that still today do not have warning labels. On vaccines, Facebook has flagged, we will flag Facebook vaccine misinformation in English, and at the same time that Spanish content takes days to get flagged, if it ever gets flagged. And for example, Facebook said it was banning content promoting false claims that the vaccine contained a microchip. Since then, we've seen Facebook label several posts in English promoting this narrative as false, but similar posts we have tracked in Spanish still have no label. And the same with QAnon, both on Facebook and YouTube, both of whom announced policies to remove or restrict QAnon content, but it continued to spread in Spanish. This is why this is important, specifically with Spanish language consumers. Latinos are more susceptible to misinformation because we are spending more time online than everybody else is. We're on YouTube twice as much as the general population, for example. And according to our research, 70% of Latinos are getting their news and information about politics and elections from YouTube as a primary source, which if you spend any amount of YouTube searching for news, this is a problem. Spanish language information voids and the changing nature of Latino media ecosystems like Facebook, WhatsApp, and YouTube makes disinformation more problematic in Latino and Spanish dominant communities because they spread like wildfire and they're going very unregulated. The last point I will just make is on both WhatsApp and Latin America. Half of Latinos in the US are using WhatsApp. The Facebook-owned messaging platform, as we know, is used by Latinos and immigrant communities ubiquitously. And we know that it is a wild, wild west for disinformation on the WhatsApp platform. I'll close by just saying that, Latinos in the United States are targeted for disinformation both by domestic and foreign actors. We are up against an entire continent of Spanish language disinformation for which the social media platforms are not treating with the level of urgency and resources that they should be.
Whew, thank you, Stephanie. Next, we're going to go to Brenda Castillo, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Media Coalition, an organization working to eliminate hate, discrimination, and racism towards the Latino community. Brenda, what are some solutions that you have proposed to curb disinformation in Spanish?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for everyone that's on this Zoom. Listen, Latinos and the Spanish-speaking community are under attack. Disinformation and hate rely on each other to thrive, and the new weapon, the vehicle to disseminate disinformation and hate towards Latinx and our platforms, specifically Facebook. Leading up to the 2020 election, NHMC, Free Press, and CAP began noticing distinct differences between how Facebook was moderating content in English versus Spanish. For instance, militia group posts calling for people to bring weapons to public spaces to threaten and intimidate us and others were sometimes being taken down in English, while nearly identical posts were left up in Spanish. Again, the post in English is taken down because it breaks Facebook's policy. However, the nearly identical posts in Spanish are left up. Not only is this an inaction disrespectful to our community, this is a form of discrimination. At the same time, research from Avaz found that Spanish language disinformation was far less likely to be flagged and taken down than similar English language messages. We raised this with Facebook several times, but they failed to remedy these problems or even give us straight answers. In March of 2021, we launched the Ya Basta Facebook campaign with leadership from Congressman Cardenas, which called on the company to, among other things, number one, enforce their standards across languages to achieve parity in content moderation practices. Number two, disclose the number of content moderators at Facebook and the number dedicated to Spanish language. And number three, regularly audit and test their machine learning algorithms across languages for effectiveness, accuracy, and bias. Findings from the Facebook papers and even today's breaking research from Global Disinformation Index highlight the ongoing pervasiveness of Spanish language disinformation across platforms. The solutions raised by the Ya Basta Facebook campaign remain relevant today, and we are now joined by dozens of other prominent Latino and non-Latino organizations in the Spanish language disinformation coalition who are calling for transparency and parity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brenda. Next, we're going to turn to Nguyen, who is a fact checker and co-founder of Viet Fact Check, an organization working to empower Vietnamese Americans with fact-checked, source-verified analysis and rebuttals in English and Vietnamese to combat the onslaught of misinformation that is circulating in the Vietnamese American community. Nick, can you shed some light on what you're seeing from your vantage point?
Absolutely. And, of course, like everyone else, it's an honor to be here. Some background. Vietnamese Americans routinely pull far closer to Democrats on major issues, yet they vote against these policies because of a fear of words. These trigger words of like socialism and communism evoke images of defeat, violence, and escape from many diasporic communities who came to our country in the last 50 years. I'm a second generation Vietnamese American, so I don't have these memories and I don't want them. When you experience something once, it's all too easy to imagine it happening again. And my friends in other communities report the same, the use of triggering imagery of violence and collapse to manipulate behavior. In the hierarchy of needs, a strong and stable country is a higher priority than healthcare. So the tech platforms like Facebook and YouTube are a gift for those who intend to do harm for myriad reasons. Money, power, and even weakening the power and prestige of the United States are all motivations for misinformation. And with no duty to the truth, it can be more easily tuned to maximize spread. It's weaponized fiction. It feeds algorithms that seek only to engage with little thought to how that engagement happens. And compounding this injustice is the simple fact that time and time again, we read about a change in policy or technology to address harms and find that these solutions are almost entirely implemented for English speakers, with little to no action in non-English languages like Spanish and Vietnamese. And when action does happen, we've observed bad actors start to use code words to evade the moderators who are not native language speakers. So when we started Viet Fact Check in September of 2020, we had a simple mission. Let's create the content that no longer gets created today. Explainers that not only debunk the technology-boosted memes of misinformation that spread so rapidly, but to build media literacy and knowledge of US history and the role of institutions like government and the criminal justice system. We'd much rather spend time teaching US history and explaining policy to our audience, but instead we're continuing to fight vaccine misinformation. We're tired and we can only do so much. At the end of the day, one group has billions of dollars in profits and the other group has to find time between work and family. Tech platforms aren't big tobacco, they're big oil. They offer many valuable services that people use and benefit from, and they're all too happy to highlight this. In this metaphor, misinformation is the oil spill that we can all see, and greedy engagement algorithms are the carbon dioxide that we can't. Because cleanup isn't free and the costs are external, tech companies aren't going to do it on their own. And I believe there's a role that government can play to incentivize big tech to operate more cleanly. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We'll next hear from Jacquelyn Mason of the Disinformation Defense League, a coalition of over 200 grassroots organizations, predominantly led by people of color. They're working across languages and in communities to fight disinformation. Jacquelyn also used to be an investigative researcher studying disinformation targeting Black and Latinx communities. Jacquelyn, what are you seeing and what are some solutions coming from grassroots leaders of color?
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you for having me. So a table that I lead through my work at Media Democracy Fund to combat online mis and disinformation is the Disinfo Defense League, a distributed national network for Black and Brown community-based organizations that are disrupting disinformation campaigns, deliberately targeting Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and other communities of color. DDL was created by and for these communities and is supported by services and insight provided by expert partners. Launched in June 2020, DDL uses coordinated strategy, disinformation training, and research to support more than 200 member organizations with resources to fortify and scale current inoculation efforts and increase cohesion and collaboration in targeted communities. Within DDL, we are well aware that mis and disinformation, which proliferates in online spaces, often disproportionately affects Black and Brown people. And over the last year, our members have seen countless falsehoods spread in their communities, and social media platforms are allowing for more misinformation to spread in other languages than they are in English. And some of the most untracked and unmoderated misinformation and disinformation online is spreading in non-English language. For instance, in Spanish language, we have seen and talked with community members about the idea of sterilization from vaccines, which was a huge through line and continues to function as a barrier from people becoming vaccinated. For voting, There were many of the false narratives as in English, such as lies about Dominion voting machines and the spread of socialism and communism in the US government. However, being that these posts were often in Spanish, these dangerous narratives proliferated with little content moderation from Facebook. Issues meant to divide Black and Latinx people also plague our communities. We saw a huge effort to spread anti-Black narratives online through the summer of the Black Lives Matter protests, with many narratives morphing into twisted anti-Black campaigns. While the inoculation efforts and media literacy we use within DDL can be very effective, weaponized narratives targeting our communities are amplified through the toxic business models of big tech and big media. Therefore, DDL is partnering with Free Press on a policy platform that will support League member engagement in the debate around government interventions to address disinformation and to ensure Black, Brown, and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities are protected. Since DDL's launch last year, we have heard from many members about the need for capacity around policy expertise and engagement. This need arose through member-driven requests and questions, and a realization that broader policy discussions about disinformation did not take the disproportionate harms to communities of color into account. So together, we are calling on Congress to adopt comprehensive digital privacy legislation that protects our digital rights. Online platforms, cable channels, and broadcasters alike have all shirked responsibility on this and accountability for their roles in spreading dangerous disinformation. Policymakers must examine how the corporate media ecosystem distorts facts and spreads lies, and move swiftly to reduce the harms. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacquelyn. And I see that we've been joined by Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's a little earlier than we anticipated. Welcome, Senator. We are going to finish up our expert panel here and then go to Commissioner Slaughter for her remarks. And then we'll come to you right directly after that, Senator, as long as that works for your schedule. If it doesn't, please pop up and let me know that if you need to go right away. I will watch to see if you flag me down. So we're going to finish this panel, and after that, we'll turn to the FTC Commissioner. But I'd like to bring Stephen Renderos, the Executive Director of Media Justice, to the floor here. Stephen is a grassroots leader with policy expertise on building solutions that protect digital, civil, and human rights. Stephen, what do you think we need from policymakers in this moment?
Great question, Jessica, and thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be here along with so many incredible leaders and also along so many colleagues that we work pretty closely with on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to actually step back a little bit and just reflect on some of the things that my colleagues have brought up. Targeted disinformation campaigns being aimed at people whose primary language is something other than English are highly influential because, as Nick brought up, they often prey on fears or legitimate lived experiences. And on platforms like Facebook and Google, as bad as these companies have been at addressing disinformation in English, and we know firsthand because we've actually been pressuring the companies to do something about this for well over 5 years now, they have been far worse at tackling this issue in other languages, as some of the research by EquisLabs points out. What's more concerning for me is just how lucrative it is for these companies to not address non-English disinformation. And it leaves a lot of vulnerable users, like many of my family members who primarily speak Spanish and who use these platforms regularly. Because we've been working on this issue for so long, it feels like the time for action was a long time ago, but we're here now. And as a result of a lot of the recent reporting on the Facebook papers and the invaluable research of so many of my colleagues, more and more lawmakers and regulators agree that these companies must be held accountable. And that's really critical because for years, there was a lack of action coming from policymakers. And these companies were essentially left to police themselves. And I believe that we need policy solutions that deliver the users of these platforms, particularly those that don't speak English, the vital data privacy and civil rights protections that they deserve. So policy solutions like bans on discriminatory algorithms, and that includes targeted advertising, limiting big tech's collection of our data, which is the currency that their wealth and business model is built on, enhanced transparency about our data, and how it's being used so that these companies can't hide behind fancy PR campaigns to shield themselves from accountability. These are the kinds of policies that a lot of our partners, and we're proud members of the Disinformation Defense League, have been considering. Now, there is good legislation that has been introduced by Senator Ed Markey and Representative Doris Matsui that would prohibit algorithmic processes on platforms that discriminate on the basis of protected classes like race and gender, and we support that. But there are also agencies like the Federal Trade Commission that can also play a very vital role in investigating and regulating the companies that are perpetuating this harm. I'll just close really quickly by saying that, as has been pointed out in many different ways, we're living through a crisis of information that is weakening our democracy and causing our communities harm. And so when searching for solutions, we have to look at places where the problem is worse. And around disinformation, non-English speakers are the canaries in the coal mine. When we think about, they say kind of follow the money when you're trying to root out political corruption. And I would say to our elected leaders and regulators here, to address racialized disinformation, follow the data and the money, and those are the solutions we need to be getting behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and to all of our expert panelists for bringing your perspectives to this conversation. I'm glad you brought up the Federal Trade Commission, because I'd like to turn next to FTC Commissioner Rebecca Kelly Slaughter. Commissioner Slaughter, we just heard community advocates sharing about the depth and breadth of harms that social media companies are causing and the particular impacts on people of color. You serve on the Federal Trade Commission, an expert agency charged with protecting American consumers. How are you thinking about this issue, and what can and should the Federal Trade Commission do to mitigate harm here?
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for organizing this really important conversation. It's such an honor to be here with this distinguished group of advocates and leaders like Senator Lujan, Senator Klobuchar, Congressman Cardenas. I think it's really important for these conversations to be happening amongst all of these groups together. Let me make a couple of points. The first is, as I think we have heard explained very clearly, disinformation causes real harm. And that harm is magnified when the disinformation is amplified in service of more engagement or more clicks on advertisements on social media platforms. In order to best address these problems, we need to do exactly what Stephen was suggesting and go back and think about what is the root cause of that amplification and that and the harm that the disinformation is causing, and how do we address that properly? So I think one important part of the conversation, and I've heard it come up in a couple different threads today, is that, historically when we've talked about data regulation or online regulation, we've talked about privacy as the sort of overarching concept. And I think privacy is a fundamentally important concept related to civil rights and individual autonomy, but it is not the only concern that we need to have for exactly the reasons that we've talked about today. Sorry, I mentioned I had a sick kid at home earlier and he has just popped in. So it's not the only concern that we need to have. I think disinformation and other concerns are equally important, which is why I want us to be thinking not just about privacy, but about data abuses generally, and the abuses that stem from the surveillance business model across the board. So what do we do about it is really the key question. Where are we now? The first thing I'll say is I'm fully on board with legislation at the federal level, at the state level, at all the levels that can help provide better tools and more affirmative requirements on platforms to limit the spread of this harm to begin with. And I think that can often start with limiting their ability to collect data in the first place, because that's what sort of fuels all of these harms. But I don't think that we at the Federal Trade Commission need to or should wait for federal legislation in order to act. I think that we have an obligation to use all the tools that we have in our statutory toolbox to carry out the mission that Congress has given us, which is to protect American consumers and competition. So what are our tools that are relevant in this space? Well, the FTC Act prohibits unfair and deceptive acts and practices. Unfair acts and practices are those that cause substantial injury that's not reasonably avoidable by the user and not outweighed by countervailing benefits. When I listen to the conversation around the harms associated with the amplification of disinformation, I hear a lot of indicia of unfair acts and practices. So the first thing I think we need to do is investigate and take appropriate enforcement action where we can if we have individual cases that violate the law. But I don't think we should limit ourselves to individual one-off enforcement actions. I think it is also time to use the rulemaking tools that we have in our toolbox. And that starts with opening a proceeding to create a record to see if there is evidence that would allow us to promulgate a trade regulation rule that address this, the kinds of harms that we're talking about today and other harms associated with unfettered data collection. So this is something I'm really excited about working with my colleagues on. I'm really excited about working with the advocates in civil society and our leaders in Congress. I think it's a big job, but it's one that we're overdue to get started on.
Thank you, Commissioner Slaughter. We are now going to turn to questions from the media. Reporters, please identify yourselves and your outlets and submit your questions through the Q&A box. I know that Senator Klobuchar is going to join us, but I don't think she's ready just yet. So I will start with the first question, and reporters, please continue to populate the Q&A box. So the first question is from Claire Atkin from Check My Ads. Facebook amplifies mis and disinformation, but the original publishers of disinformation only collect revenue when users click on the links and visit the disinformation outlet's website. There, users are shown digital advertising and the publisher receives a payout. This dynamic between Facebook and disinformation publishers creates an incentive structure where clickbait in the form of hate bait receives the most clicks and brings in more revenue. How are you conceiving of regulation aimed at companies like Cargo, OpenX, Teads, Triple Lift, OpenWeb, Pubmatic, Xandr, AOL, Magnite, and the many other advertising exchanges that have so-called direct business relationships with disinformation outlets that are often in contradiction to their own corporate policies? All right, there's a lot in there. Does someone want to take this? Commissioner, have you been doing any thinking around the ad services themselves?
I think the way to answer that question, and it is a big question, is I think it's important to think about the entire ecosystem and how it works together. And again, some of what we hear in what I hear in that question goes back to me to the issue of, well, what's the root cause? Like, where is all of this amplification coming from, these other sort of associated problems? And I continue to think that we need to keep thinking about questions or solutions that start with the collection of data to begin with, that creates the marketplace for micro-targeted surveillance advertising that adds all this fuel to the fire. So I think we should be looking at platforms, sure. We should be looking at additional actors too, of course, but whoever we look at, we should be understanding their role in the broader market ecosystem.
I would just add one thing, Jessica, here, which is, and Commissioner Slaughter, I think that's right, looking at the entire ecosystem is really important. I think one of the things that has puzzled me has been, Google and Facebook have these incredible, and have invested lots of resources into content ID for copyright infringement. So it's always kind of puzzled me when we're trying to track like the footprint and the thumbprint of certain pieces of disinformation, why certain kinds of technology like that can't be scaled and used, especially to figure out how we identify like the how far, disinformation and especially disinformation that has been taken down in English can be taken down in other languages as well by imagery or other things that they're already using for things to take down copyright infringement content as well.
And Ms. González, just to build from Commissioner Slaughter and Ms. Valencia, look, let's talk about full transparency here as well. In the same case that when we talk about political ads, like the Disclose Act, we should know who's behind these ads, right? And oftentimes people are hiding behind this disinformation because they're able to exploit the system and make a quick buck, and they're lying to people, they're endangering people, and sometimes costing them their lives. So in the same way, when we're talking about these social media platforms, that they should not be profiting off of algorithms that are spreading dangerous and harmful content, the same needs to apply to this other side. With transparency, with disclosure, and the same application with what we will be pursuing with social media platforms needs to be the equivalent on this advertising side as well.
Thank you, Senator. Anyone else want to get in here on this question?
Jessica, if I can just add, I mean, we really, NHMC really believe there's needs to be a federal agency with the authority to regulate these media platforms. Just like the FCC regulates broadcasting. If there was a broadcast station, and I don't want to pick one, but let's just say it was called UCB, and they constantly had disinformation over and over and over again that caused harm to the public, their license would be in question. So that's, I think, we strongly believe that there needs to be a federal agency with some type of authority that can pull someone's business license when they continue to operate and profit off of hate and disinformation, especially when they're targeting a minority community. That's discrimination. It's a civil rights issue.
Thank you, Brenda. And I see that we've been joined by Senator Klobuchar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I do want to turn it over to you, Senator, and hear from you. And then we will go back to press Q&A, and I'll just urge the press to continue to populate the Q&A box with your questions. Senator, thank you for joining us. You've been an outspoken leader on this and many other issues.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Ben Ray. I love working with you on this. Commissioner, I know the representative was on. And so thank you, everyone. It's just really an honor to be part of this. I think all of you know how important it is to keep people safe online and safe from lies about elections. And I think one of the reasons Ben Ray and I have come together on a number of issues is because we know how that disinformation is hurting our democracy and hurting the way people can participate and be part of. If they start believing things that aren't true, there's real consequences. I think everyone in this building knows it. I'm sitting just a few yards away from the Senate floor, where we saw how real this all was on January 6th, when insurrectionists stormed the Capitol with the aim of overturning the election. They organized online on platforms like Facebook. They were influenced by online disinformation. They were also influenced by the president. They literally, these views were promoted by Facebook's own algorithms. I just found out when the documents were leaked that they actually, on the algorithms, that a angry face gets 5 times the amount of traction with their algorithms as a like. I think that kind of says it all to what's been going on with our politics and what's been happening. I remember talking to a cafe worker in Minnesota, right near my house. And she said, well, he said, my mother-in-law isn't going to get the vaccine because she read online that it would implant a microchip in her arm. These are examples of the effects of misinformation and there are countless more like it that are just plain lies. But when we know that nearly all coronavirus deaths and hospitalizations are among the unvaccinated, those lies are deadly, especially when we know that so many Americans that haven't gotten vaccines believe common myths about the vaccines, myths that go viral online. And this is a particular concern I know has been your subject today for Americans who speak other languages, because platforms are even more behind when it comes to cracking down on non-English disinformation. There are more than 100 languages in my home state of Minnesota, so I know how important it is that big tech companies get this right. Unfortunately, reports have shown that Facebook will flag English language posts containing lies about vaccines days before acting on the same post in Spanish. Sometimes the Spanish posts never get flagged. You can still find Spanish language Facebook posts from November 2020 that promote election lies with no warning labels. Last year, experts also found that election Spanish language disinformation was widely spreading on WhatsApp, targeting users based on their culture and heritage with divisive content, aiming to stoke racial divisions. This is so dangerous because we're talking about viral content. The other day, I made the analogy. If someone yells fire in a crowded theater, we know that's not protected speech, right? But whatever happens, the theater is probably not liable as long as they have safety exits, things like this. But what if they had speakers they decided to install in all of their multiplexes? And so that when someone yelled fire, it went in all the other theaters and caused stampedes or people running into each other. That's what we're talking about with amplification. And even an hour-long delay in a post with health disinformation being flagged or taken down can result in thousands and thousands of people being exposed to dangerous lies. We don't have to wonder why this is happening. Frances Haugen, the whistleblower, she testified that 87% of the company's spending to counter misinformation is spent on English language misinformation, but only about 9% of the users are English speakers. Earlier this year, Ben Ray and I sent letters to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Nextdoor seeking transparency on their processes for removing harmful Spanish language content. The responses, in my mind, were evasive, raising concerns about their commitment to combating disinformation in all languages, especially Spanish. We also partnered together to take on the Disinformation Dozen, the 12 accounts responsible for 65% of coronavirus misinformation online. And it took a while, Ben Ray, but we started to see success after a few months. Again, every single hour that goes by, more people get exposed. We also have a bill to hold online platforms accountable for the spread of health-related misinformation. And we partnered this last week on another letter, or this week, that seeks more information on whether efforts to counter Spanish language disinformation on WhatsApp were blocked because of concerns they would not be seen. And this was really a shocker, came out again recently in Facebook's words as politically neutral. Give me a break. I think about all of the language translations that go on all the time for voters, for people when they visit the hospital and the like. And Facebook now is saying, well, if we do that, it might not be politically neutral. The stakes are too high to wait around for big tech companies to act. This is about our very democracy. This is about people's health. I am so glad to have Senator Lujan as a partner in the Senate, fighting to keep all Americans safe online. I personally believe, and I'm sure you've talked about this, that we're starting to see some momentum because when that whistleblower started speaking, every parent in America, as one parent from Brooklyn told me recently, said, you know what? I feel like every day when I'm trying to protect my kids and I try to find a new filter or try to turn off a link, it is literally like water filling a sink and it keeps filling and I'm out there with a mop and then something else happens and it just keeps overflowing when I'm trying to raise my kids and I get this headwinds against me. That's what we're dealing with. But again, when she opened her mouth, started talking, I think all the parents in America goes, okay, I'm not alone. And so now it's on us to act and do something about it. Thanks so much, Ben Ray, for including me. Oh, you're muted. There.
I just said, well said, Amy. That is well said.
Okay.
Nothing to add to that. That's spot on. Thank you. Thanks for everything you do.
Good. Very good. Okay, you guys doing questions or what are you doing?
Yeah, we're gonna take some questions now, Senator. Thank you so much for those remarks. We have a question coming in from Suzanne Gamboa from NBC Latinx. She's asking, how far can you go to hold political organizations and campaigns responsible if they pay for advertising that is misinformation?
Could I just take one stab at that just because?
Sure, please,
I'll
go
let
ahead.
Henry. So one of the things that I've been trying for years is to get those campaigns and get through when they advertise on the social media platforms, that they have to have disclaimers and disclosures. And of course, there would be then liability attached to that if they didn't do it, just like what we do with a lot of traditional media. And they fought that for a long time. Now they say they're okay with it. They do some of it on their own platforms. It's a bipartisan bill, originally with Senator McCain, now with Senator Graham. And what's interesting and relevant for today is that it is in the Freedom to Vote Act that every Democrat, including Senator Manchin, is supporting. So there's actually a way to put those standards in place, and disclaimers, of course, we know what that all means, that you have to say prepared and paid for by, but disclosures would actually require every single platform that the bill covers, which is a lot of them, to disclose what those ads are. I remember at one point, one of the companies at a hearing told me that they couldn't do it because it was too hard, you know? These are trillion-dollar companies. And I said, you know what's so weird about that answer? My radio station in Thief River Falls, Minnesota, they somehow can figure out how to display their radio ads so people can see it. I think you guys can do the same. So that is actually part of what we're doing because of this relationship with the disinformation.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And the radio companies managed to do that because broadcasters are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, and there are ad disclosure rules. I saw the commissioner go off mute. So Commissioner Slaughter, please come on in here.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. What Senator Klobuchar just said reminds me that when my daughter was in kindergarten, her teacher would say to her class all the time, kindergartners can do hard things. And that's what I think whenever I hear people say, well, it's too hard, we can't do that. We can do hard things. Trillion-dollar companies can do hard things, and they need to. I think Senator Klobuchar's leadership on disclosures is extremely important. And I think I will make 2 points about an enforcement perspective from the FTC side. The first is fraud is illegal, and we need to pursue fraudulent misinformation, and we do. Congress gave us the authority to get civil penalties for fraud related to COVID misinformation, and we've already used that authority. So we need to keep doing that. But the other thing that I would make, the other point that I would make is that the issue with political misinformation and disinformation on platforms isn't just the political organizations buying that misinformation. That is a huge part of it. It is also the amplification of that information. And that's the issue we keep coming back to again and again. What is being amplified and why is it being amplified? And to me, this keeps coming back to in service of more engagement, more clicks on more ads, and more advertising dollars. So I think we need to keep our eye on the prize too of the broader ecosystem.
Thank you, Commissioner. Why is it being amplified, but also how? And I do think this comes back to how these companies are not only amplifying, but they're amplifying and targeting to certain groups based on demographic and behavioral data, right? And so that is where we need, I think, some interventions here. I'm going to take us to another question from Anoa Chunga with News One. They ask, what steps should media take when reporting so that they are raising awareness but not amplifying bad information? I know the Disinformation Defense League has done some work around how to mitigate disinformation while not amplifying it. I'm wondering if either Jacquelyn or Stephen have some thoughts on this. And of course, all the, the senators, the congressmen, or the commissioner are welcome to come in.
I can talk a little bit about that. Sorry, Stephen. Yeah, so, we know often that newsrooms do not represent the communities that they're meant to serve, right? Black communities are unrepresented, Latino communities are unrepresented. I think something that we try to do within the Disinfo Defense League is bridge that gap find where the gaps are and have these, people who are on the ground, organizers, people who understand the flow of misinformation, researchers, work hand in hand with journalists, right? We've done a few projects like that with First Draft, a few other research and news companies in order to bridge that gap and bring those companies together. So that's something we really strive for with our members of the league.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to it, and I was looking at Jacquelyn because from her background working at First Draft, they've developed curriculum to work with journalists to improve coverage around specific topics like the elections, to ensure that they're not serving as amplification points, because disinformation campaigns are designed to go from spreading through platforms to then at some point peeking into the public discourse by getting onto more legitimate channels of information. So it is by design that they're trying to do that. So I think being better equipped as journalists to ensure the purpose for why you're reporting on a particular topic. And again, I think First Draft would be a great resource to kind of go a little bit deeper into the topic and teach like actual skills on how to make those determinations for yourself.
Thank you, Stephen. Senator, you want to get in? Senator
No, I'm
Lujan?
just listening. I was nodding my head in agreement.
Jessica, I jump in there. Look, stop spreading the lie, right? And hold people accountable when they're doing it. I won't name any of the affiliates or the news shows or the personalities that do it. We all know who they are, and they've been called out. Just as Senator Klobuchar reminded us all of the dirty dozen, if you will, that were responsible for all of that misinformation or most of it online. We also know who's doing it on broadcast. Stop it. And we need to hold people accountable. So just as we saw, I'm going to take us back all the way to the 2016 elections with all of the hacks that were taking place, and even news outlets were knowingly using Russian hacked information and reporting on it, encouraging more of that bad behavior. So whether it's that kind of activity or the spreading of the lie and then the repeating of the spreading of the lie and then reporting on the lie itself, it's got to stop. And we should hold everyone accountable, but every one of these outlets and networks has a responsibility to call it out where they see it and just stop it.
Thank you, Senator. This reminds me of some research that I know the National Hispanic Media Coalition did, believe it or not, almost a decade ago now, about how online conspiracy theorists gained credibility by making it onto the mainstream, and how mainstream media was gathering followers or trying to attract new audiences by bringing on popular pundits. And there is a very interconnected web of conspiracy theorists and bigots, just to be really frank, that are working together to amplify these messages. I am very happy, actually, that we came back to this, because we're really recognizing that we're looking at an ecosystem that allows lies to proliferate. And we are at time. So I would like to thank everyone for being here today to move this conversation from outrage to solutions. I'm very excited about many of the solutions broached here today, especially the call for Congress to adopt digital privacy and civil rights legislation, as well as an FTC rulemaking on harmful data and algorithmic abuses. On behalf of Senator Lujan and Free Press Action, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to working together with all of you on next steps to build the internet we deserve.
Okay. Very good. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Really,
Thanks
I'm
for your
actually going to
time.
the floor to speak about tech.
Thank you.
So there we go. See you
Bring
soon.
our energy
Bye.
with you, Senator. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.